It's fantastic to join you all for this in the next series of events that we're doing around COP26. Whilst events continue to unfold in Glasgow, we're delighted to work with a range of partners to deliver a series of virtual events here in Australia. This session is on mapping Australia's path to clean energy, and I would like to thank our partnership with the Grattan Institute in delivering this exciting panel to discuss a very important agenda for Australia's own position and opportunity on this road. This is the halfway point in COP26. We're reaching the end of the first week before the final week next week. Yesterday was Energy Day in Glasgow, and we will be picking up those key themes during the course of the panel discussions this morning. But there are things in particular to focus on, not least the commitment to rapid phase out of unabated coal and the acceleration of transition to renewables. As Alex Sharner, our COP president, said yesterday, this is a moment when we consign coal to history. But we also know that we have to be pragmatic. This is a process that will take the next 30 to 50 years. We've heard from China about their net zero commitment for 2060 and India for 2070. Whether or not the investment in new technology and infrastructure, particularly around new renewables, will see those deadlines come forward, we shall see, but that is something that we will all work on. So today we'll explore the role of energy. My colleague Akil Abraham will shortly set out a digest of yesterday's COP26 Energy Day. He will be followed by Tony Wood, Director of the Energy Programme at the Grattan Institute, who will introduce and moderate today's panel. The first panel will deal with the challenge of phasing out unabated coal-fired power stations here in Australia. The second panel will discuss and explore the opportunities for Australia as the global energy systems shift towards renewables, and the huge potential that Australia has to be part of this new global energy market as an exporter of new renewable energy, as an exporter of the critical minerals that will be vital to this new industry. I'm really looking forward to hearing what the panels have to say and the conclusions that they reach. But what I would also like to say to the audience is that COP26 is not an end in itself. It is really the start of a journey. It is a journey that needs us all to work together. The next decade will determine whether or not we keep 1.5 degrees within reach. We know that that is essential before we reach a tipping point. And that tipping point is one we must collectively not allow to happen. Otherwise, the consequences will be too great. This is about our economies, our people, and our communities. It is about having the narrative that can give the assurances and a confidence of a better, greener future ahead. And of course, when we talk about unabated coal, I know the British government knows, all our governments understand, reassuring the communities that might fear that future and remove that and show them and share a vision of what is possible, the new jobs of the future. What does technology actually mean? And how do we manage this change to that better future? I will now hand over to Akil Abraham for the digest of yesterday's Energy Day. Thank you. Akil.
Thank you very much, High Commissioner. And I'm happy to now give an overview of what's been happening in this first week, specifically on Energy Day, but taking a look back at what happened at the beginning of COP26 and the World Leaders Summit, where 120 heads of government and heads of state attended. We saw a flurry of commitments, including on 2030 targets, on net zero targets, as the High Commissioner mentioned, and this will have significant impacts on the energy system as a whole. I was heartened to see that the IEA put out a figure saying if all pledges are met, we could now be on a 1.8 degree trajectory, which is a real big move from where we were before COP or even a year ago when the UK uptook this presidency. So on Energy Day itself, I mean, just before we get to that, there are a couple of big pledges that I think will be relevant. One of them is on forestation. There was a big forest pledge by over 120 countries, which is of interest around emissions from deforestation and agriculture. The other big one was the methane pledge, where over 100 countries committed to a cut of methane emissions by 30% by 2030 on 2020 levels. Another big significant move for a significant greenhouse gas for this decade, and especially for, say, fugitive emissions for LNG extraction. There was also a big focus on finance, both the public spending, and I'll get into some of the coal-specific stuff in a minute, but also on what the private sector is doing. There are some 130 trillion in managed assets looking to align with net zero. But let's get to Energy Day itself. And this is essentially about bringing together governments, businesses, investors, and organizations to shift to clean power. As the High Commissioner and our COP president has said, this is about seeing within reach the end of unabated coal power, which is still some way away, but we've seen quite a bit of progress, especially overnight. I'm happy to inform that a 190-strong coalition has overnight agreed to both the phase out of coal power and the end of support of new coal power plants. And this does include, for the first time, 18 countries not willing to build or invest in coal, notably Poland, Vietnam, Chile, and then there's a few more in our part of the world as well, which I'll get to. This is really quite a big milestone, considering where some of those economies and power systems are at. Major international banks committed to end international coal power financing. So this aligns with what else has happened this year, which has been quite significant, which is the announcements at the G7 by Japan and also Korea, and then the G20 announcement just at the beginning of a COP, and obviously China a bit earlier at the UN General Assembly, essentially ending the public finance of international coal power investments as of the end of this year. So this is a really important trend. When we're getting specific to coal phase out itself, we've seen 23 countries make new commitments to phase out coal. This includes 5 of the world's top 20 coal power users. So that includes South Korea, Indonesia, Vietnam, Poland, and Ukraine. And then similar to that, there has been commitments for no new coal power, including Poland, but also Vietnam and Morocco. This also matches others from the developing world like Pakistan, Malaysia, and Philippines, but those are announced recently, and a bit earlier, Sri Lanka, Chile, Montenegro, and other European partners. So again, we're seeing that trajectory shift. Obviously, not every country is signing up to these things, but a definite shift, and it's not just, say, specific parts of the world anymore. It's not just about Europe. I would note there's also been a focus even wider than coal on the international public support side. We've seen a grouping or a declaration, political declaration of 25 countries committing to the end of international public support for unabated fossil fuels in the energy sector by the end of 2022. And this includes big names like Italy, Canada, United States, Denmark, who have traditionally been funding these sorts of things. And so there's going to be quite a bit of a shift, I suppose, in overseas development support for fossil fuels by some of these donors. But finally, I also want to cover off what is actually happening in these emerging economies that are committing to higher renewable targets or potential coal phase out. We've seen India, Indonesia, Philippines, and South Africa come into partnerships with donor money to help fund the transition. Indonesia and Philippines announced a partnership with the Asian Development Bank to support the early retirement of coal plants. And we heard Indonesia's finance minister potentially speak about a 2040 phase-out date. And there was an $8.5 billion deal for South Africa from some donor countries to help with their own power sector transition and a just transition. Just hitting some of the headline initiatives that were announced overnight. There is a global coal to clean power transition statement. This is essentially a political statement, which we'd be happy to share with you, which is what I've just spoken to around investment in new coal, deployment of renewables, and the phase out of coal on a reasonable trajectory to get us to that 1.5 trajectory, which is roughly 2030s for OECD countries and roughly 2040 or the 2040s for the rest of the economies. There's a grouping called Powering Past Coal Alliance, which has existed for a while, but that's accepted a few new members, including Chile and Singapore, and some big financial institutions as well, including banks that cover about 17 trillion in assets. And there's also been some movement there on subnational and utilities, specifically in Poland, South Africa, Philippines, and the US. There was a Just Transition Declaration, which is where donors are looking to help support a lot of these jurisdictions that are moving away from coal as best as possible. And there was also a couple of other things that may have not made the press, a move towards better product efficiency. So a commitment by, I believe, 14 countries, including Australia, to double product efficiency of lighting, cooling, motors, and refrigeration by 2030. So this is about better energy efficiency. Earlier in the week, the Prime Minister Johnson announced the Glasgow breakthroughs, which is about seeing cost reductions in key technologies across the world and working together with other countries. So I'm happy to announce there is an energy-focused one, along with steel and road transport and hydrogen. And Australia, along with 32 other countries, including some of the big players like China and India, have committed to this breakthrough. Also, on the international side, there was an announcement of something called the Green Grids Initiative. So this is essentially trying to focus on the accelerated deployment of clean energy, not just within borders, but cross-border, and developing the infrastructure to help almost continental energy shifts. And Australia is part of the steering committee for this Green Grids Initiative that's being led by Prime Minister Johnson and Prime Minister Modi from India. The idea is to have this coalition of governments, financiers, power system operators to share expertise, build consensus and strategic coordination to integrate grids worldwide, and that includes things ranging from sun cable and hydrogen for export. So from what I've just covered off, there is a large focus on coal and coal phase out, but there's also a large focus on funding that transition as best as possible. To support a lot of the nationally determined contributions and net zero targets that are being set by countries around the world. There's still a lot more to do. Clean power needs to progress probably 4 to 6 times faster than say where we were before COP opened. And we know we have to provide that renewable, affordable, reliable power, as we have seen in other parts of the world, if we're to have any chance of having a credible decarbonisation pathway in the power sector. But from what we've seen in this last year, things are moving. It's not just about particular geographies anymore. Movements are happening everywhere, from the financial side to country-specific plans. The coal power trajectory and the principles around it seem to be well set towards phase out. It's just a matter of time and a matter of the right policy settings and finance around it. And markets in other countries will continue to transition from that. So I'm going to leave it there and throw it over to Tony, but I hope that was a useful overview. Thank you.
Okay, thank you, Akhil. And also I'd like to thank the High Commissioner. We've been very pleased to join in this, presenting this webinar in conjunction with the British government and the UK government, and particularly having the insight that both the High Commissioner and Akhil have given us into how this has been going. So we're going to have 2 discussions. One related to the phase out of unabated coal-fired power, which Akhil referred to, and one looking more at the opportunities and to some extent the international challenges that Australia then faces in a low emission world, and how we might grasp those opportunities. We are taking an Australian focus on this discussion today, and I'm sure many of you listening or watching this webinar would have been seeing the coverage of Australia's engagement with the COP. I think, largely speaking, you'd say a lot of positives and some negatives. And that tends to be what happens in these sorts of events. I've got very fortunate to have three people who are going to join this first session, who have a very deep understanding but quite different previous involvements with the way in which our energy system is evolving in Australia, particularly our electricity system, which is where the whole issue of unabated coal-fired power comes in. First of those is James Hart. James is an associate with Grattan. James has been working with us for several years now, and in particular did a very deep dive into understanding what a low emission, high renewables electricity grid would look like in Australia, and demonstrated through a very detailed economic model that Australia could do an awful lot in this direction. We could go to very high levels of renewables with, to some extent, almost zero and very low impact on cost and no impact on reliability. And as you get beyond that, it gets a bit harder. But James, fortunately, he did that work, most of it when the COVID shutdown of the University of Melbourne was at its worst. So he was able to beg, borrow and steal computer power to run his model. It might have been a bit more difficult trying to do it now, I suspect. The second speaker is Kerry Schott. Kerry, only last week, or the weekend, I guess technically, Kerry stepped down from the chair of the independent chair of the Energy Security Board. Now, the Energy Security Board was a creature of the current government, particularly when Malcolm Turnbull was Prime Minister, and it was introduced to try and bring together two big issues. One was the work that had largely been started by Alan Finkel and been picked up by the government itself to try and connect energy and climate policy. And the other one, more recent one, was to look in a very detailed way at what Australia's electricity market needed to look like if we're going to be maintain a reliable, competitively priced and low emission electricity system. And that report, the report was delivered to the energy ministers of Australia only about a month or so ago, and largely they've adopted those recommendations. So Kerry can walk away feeling that she's done a great job in that sense. She'll now tell us in the next few minutes what she really thinks, since she's no longer constrained by being the chair. And thirdly, we have Tennant Reid. This is actually an avatar of Tennant Reid. Tennant Reid is actually fast asleep at the moment because he's been dialing into the COP himself directly. Tennant, I think I'll say this in a loving way, Tennant, one of Australia's leading energy nerds. There's very few people who've been at the forefront, not just at the interface really, between the debate around energy and climate change and the impact that all this has and the opportunity it has for business, because he's been working with the Australian Industry Group now for several years. Whenever there's a serious discussion around this sort of material, if Tennant's not there, then it's not as serious as they thought it was going to be. So I think it's a great opportunity to have this conversation with these three people who've got slightly different perspectives, but hopefully will give you an idea of the sort of issues that we're grappling with. So I guess the interesting, Australia, on the issue of the unabated, of the phase out of unabated coal-fired power, this is not something that we've decided to support in the same way that other countries have. And you can have your own views as to why that might or might not be. But when you look at even something as recent and arguably not particularly complex as the transition plan that the government announced last week, you will see that that includes a step up in the phase out of coal-fired power. So clearly the government recognises that is going to happen. You can debate, and we might hear a little bit of that from the three speakers as to what's going to drive that. But it does, I think it's now unquestionable that the rate of phasing out of unabated coal-fired power in Australia will only increase. And I think whilst we're very careful to use the word unabated, it's difficult to see how anyone would build, I think, to build a coal-fired power station with abated emissions. Trying to build a coal-fired power station with CCS, something that I was deeply involved with some years ago now, it seems like worse than science fiction in terms of whether it might ever happen again. So I think we can confidently say it's the phase out of coal-fired power. in Australia. So let's get into this. I wanted to start with James because he's done a lot of number fumbling in this area. And one of the big issues that comes up when people talk about phasing out of coal-fired power is, well, how are we going to maintain a reliable system, right? It's all very well to have a few solar panels on your roof. And if you're really serious, you might put a battery in the garage. We're talking about Sydney, Melbourne, Adelaide, Brisbane, Perth, Hobart, etc., right? Darwin. How the earth are you going to do that? James, you've got the answers. How are we going to do that?
Thanks, Tony. So I think first off, what we should do is recognize the type of power that coal provides. So it provides bulk electricity. It usually runs pretty flat. It's quite an inflexible source of electricity. And this style of operation is known as baseload. But baseload doesn't necessarily mean reliable. So coal plants can break, as we saw recently with the Callide C plant explosion. There are also a lot of the coal-fired power stations in Australia are getting very old, and that's increasing the risk of technical failure. And when it's hot and everyone has their air conditioning on, it's not coal that's ramping up to meet that extra demand. It's usually hydro and gas, and now also batteries that are sort of filling that extra bit of demand. So given that coal is not necessarily reliable itself, there's no reason to think that a system without coal has to be unreliable. There are many electricity systems that don't use coal. But there are challenges for Australia as we move away from coal-fired power. And the two main ones are the timing of coal closure and the need to balance or firm renewable energy supplies and variable renewable energy like wind and solar as they enter. So I guess that on the first of those, the timing is really critical because if coal plants suddenly break down or shut down without much notice, then that doesn't give the market enough time to respond and build new supply. So it's great that we now have clearer timelines for coal closure in Australia, and in the National Electricity Market, or the NEM, every coal plant bar one has told the market operator when it plans to close. But what we've also seen over the last year is 3 of those coal plants have actually brought forward their closure dates. So that's Yallourn in Victoria and Eraring and Mount Piper in New South Wales. So we're seeing those dates brought forward all the time. Now, on the other side, aside from timing, the issue of firming renewable supply. So firming is really about being confident that you have sufficient power when you need it. And that's important if your system is going to be based on wind and solar because they're variable sources of energy. And there's at least 4 ways to firm renewable energy. So they are overbuilding your supply, connecting diverse locations with transmission, making demand more flexible, and building dispatchable capacity. So briefly on those, the first part, overbuilding supply, you can substantially build a lot more wind and solar than we're planning to today. And the idea behind that is that even when it's cloudy or when the wind is weak, you'll still get a lot of power. That helps a little bit in firming. The second option was building in diverse locations, so that even if it's cloudy, you're still in one location. You might be able to get power from somewhere else. And Australia is quite lucky in that the NEM is one of the longest interconnected power systems in the world. And we know that the wind in far north Queensland is uncorrelated with the wind in Victoria, for example. So if you build wind turbines in both locations, that helps to smooth out the variation in the local renewable supply. But building in diverse places means building more transmission. And if you build more transmission between states, then you can also share not just supply, but also balance out differences in demand between states. And this can help to reduce the amount of generation infrastructure that each state will need. The third option was making demand more flexible. And that means being able to reduce consumption when power is scarce, when there's not very much of it around. And having smarter homes and buildings can help, but potentially the biggest source of flexible demand could be a future hydrogen industry. Because if you have a large hydrogen industry that's using a lot of electricity to convert water to hydrogen, then those plants can potentially shut off when the price of electricity is too high, and that will help to ease supply constraints. And we kind of see an example in a different industry today where aluminium smelters can do that, but they can only do it for a few hours before their pot lines freeze, whereas hydrogen electrolyzers can be much more flexible. And the last of those 4 options for firming a renewables grid is dispatchable capacity. which are power sources that can be turned on or off quickly when they're needed. And that could be energy storage, like batteries or pumped hydro, or it could be burning a fuel like gas or one day hydrogen. And so this last option, dispatchable capacity, has gotten a lot of attention recently, and we saw the federal government set a 1 gigawatt target for new dispatchable capacity to be built in New South Wales before the Liddell coal-fired power station shuts in 2023. And they plan on meeting that target partly by building their own gas-fired power station at Kurri Kurri. So kind of a long story short, the coal that we've got that's leaving the NEM is itself getting less reliable as it ages. And the renewables that are entering can be firmed using any of those strategies, or very likely a combination of those strategies. So there's no reason to think that we can't have a reliable, affordable, and low emissions electricity system without keeping coal around.
So, Kerry, one of the, I think, the original, I sort of start to lose track of some of the history of some of this, but one of the reason justifications for the introduction of the Energy Security Board was associated with, originally, I think to a degree, the blackout in South Australia and the Finkel Review, but then subsequently concerns around these issues of how do you maintain a reliable system, and more particularly, what sort of market structure is going to be necessary to bring in the investment we need. I mean, now that you spent several years deeply involved in this, as you look back over that, how would you summarise the challenge that's associated with the phase out of coal-fired power? Oh, you're on mute, I think. Sorry.
I think James has covered the main issues we were grappling with quite well, but it's important that everybody recognises, I think, that the South Australian blackout was actually not about renewable power. It was about two things, really: a phenomenal storm which caused transmission lines to just fall over like matchsticks, and there was no getting away from that. And the other element to it was basically the response. And because the operator of the system is still, and indeed still is, learning how to run a system with renewables, when we look back on it now, we would all say it could have been managed a lot better and the outage would not have been so severe and widespread. But one of the things about renewables coming in is what's driven change in Australia has been renewables targets, and there has been no matching attempt to make sure that we've got the short and long duration storage that we need to back it up, that James was alluding to. And we're getting there in a very disorganised and rather chaotic way. And we will get there, probably not as efficiently as we can. But I think short duration storage, I don't think we've got much of a problem with going forward. We do need coordination around it, but we've got plenty of batteries and hydros coming, and the phase out is going to be sort of sufficiently manageable, I think. But long duration storage, we do have an issue with, and as the coal goes, particularly if it goes quickly, we do need to transition with gas. And Australia, just because of the way the system runs, is going to need gas as a transition fuel until we've got hydrogen available. And once hydrogen's available, we can ditch gas altogether. But until then, we will need gas. But I think in terms of the emissions targets, I've got no doubt that coal-fired power is nearing the end of its life. It's going to go. It's not economic. I think the dates that James put for some of the coal-fired power stations, they're all going to come forward. You can see every time they announce their results, they're doing impairments and writing down their profitability, and they're just going. But the challenge that brings with it is making sure we've got something there when they go. And that's really been what the Energy Security Board's been looking at. And it's not just suppliers making sure we've got enough frequency and inertia and system strength in the system to keep everything stable.
So, Kerry, I think, Tana, I'm interested in, when Kerry uses the words chaotic and uncoordinated, I'm sure your members are pretty comfortable, right? You're happy to just... So when the ex-chair of the Energy Security Board uses that language, how do you think about that in terms of the implications for the businesses that you represent?
So we're steering between two hazards or two monsters that energy users worry about. And one of them is, well, what if these things close and we don't have enough capacity to replace them, or enough of whatever to replace them? And then we get, like, the better case is that we get a market for a few years like we had in the wake of the closure of Hazelwood and a number of other plants that closed, where it's just tight, prices are very high, there's an ongoing worry about reliability, although in that case, like, outcomes actually were very, very good. And we'll be paying through the nose for it until the market catches up or something catches up. So that's on one side. And then the other fear is that we get too much response, too much preparation, and we get gold plating of the system with too many assets. But like, both of those fears are very live. I would say there is probably more fear at the moment about the gold plating story, because the political strategy that every government in the country really has adopted around this is to not embrace the closures explicitly, but to prepare for them, to try to cram into the system as it stands on its face the assets that it will need when the closures take place, so that they can say, when whatever closure is announced, well, this brings us no joy, we didn't want to see this come forward, but hey, look, here's an electricity system we prepared earlier. And the mismatch between what is actually happening, as Kerry says, like these closures are clearly coming forward, the fundamentals are driving them. Governments continue to try to understate or not acknowledge that speed with which it's happening, but they are also clearly preparing. And there's any number of assets or interventions that different governments are making that make no sense whatsoever unless these closures take place, very much including things that the federal government is supporting. The official story is starting to catch up in the recent national long-term emissions strategy. The people could have argued for some more content there, but one of the things that was in there was a projection that we would be at 91% renewables or thereabouts in the next couple of decades. And so, there's an element of make me virtuous, but not yet in that. That any given closure is probably going to be see gnashing of teeth, but the change is happening, and Snowy 2, the Battery of the Nation and Marinus Link, all the massive mega projects that are popping up and getting various support, like they should be able to help. The fear that energy users have, I think, one of them is that if we don't have a more open debate where all the premises and the assumptions are on the table, we might not be picking the very best assets and coordinating them in the very best way to actually get through this in the best shape. If everybody could say what they mean and mean what they say, and do policy in the sunlight, not the darkness, we'd probably get better outcomes. But we are where we are.
Yeah.
Just to pick up on that, Tennant, the point about the 91% renewables by 2040. I mean, even if you look just over the next decade, when the federal government put out its most recent projections for emissions out to 2030, it projected that we would be 30% below our 2005 level emissions by 2030. And that 30% figure rests on an additional 4 gigawatts of coal closing in the NEM relative to what the plant operators have said will close by 2030. So that, you know, we're kind of, governments are counting on accelerated coal closure to meet their climate commitments. And so clearly, you know, something's got to give.
So,
and
Karen,
it's
what do you
actually
think?
happening, sorry, Tony, it's actually happening faster than the numbers in that report. I mean, the system now is running, has days where it's running with over 50% renewables. And as we know, some jurisdictions are running at much higher levels than that consistently. So by 2030, it's going to be much larger amount of renewables. But the point Tennant makes, Tony, is absolutely right. It's the adjustment process that's difficult and does need some management, preferably not through regulation, but better through market mechanisms if we can get them to work properly.
Your recommendations of the Energy Security Board talked a lot about the mechanisms to provide the right pricing incentives for the investment we need as this happens. One of the issues that seemed to me didn't get quite as much attention in the final report is this question of, do we need anything on the issue of coal closure? I mean, whether it creates real certainty or not, I'm always a bit uncertain myself. But what's your view about that issue? And do you think that, you know, if we get the market signals right, then we will see closure and balancing work out through themselves through that market? Or do you think we are really going to need to have something that is either a forestop or a backstop to deliver coal closure?
The coal closure thing we did look at quite closely and have looked at closely, and the notice that the generators have to give to the operator are now much more clear and more detailed than they have been in the past. But having said that, we're still in a world where the politicians don't actually want people to know that plants are closing. So Australia finds itself in a curious position because our coal industry, only a very small part of it goes into coal-fired generators. Most of it goes into ships and goes somewhere else. And it's actually the export of coal that they're all worried about adjusting to. And as sure as night follows day, that's going to go down as well. But it's how you adjust the industry to that, because it's a very major Australian industry. So in the sorts of commitments the South Koreans are making will have huge impacts on that industry. But the problem we've got is trying to coordinate things when you can't have an open discussion about it. And Tennant's absolutely right. No one wants to talk about it, and they are putting things in place to try and deal with it. And the only state that has requested more work on coal closures has been New South Wales, who are quite worried because they've got 12 gigawatts of renewables coming in over the next decade. And as sure as night follows day, their coal plants are going to be really hammered by that.
I guess the night follows day is probably a particularly relevant way of thinking about it too, I guess. I guess what's interesting, is that, as you say, that the numbers that James was talking about absolutely highlight what's going to happen in New South Wales, because I think this is the first time in this plan that we've seen, or in the government's projections of what's going to happen in the electricity sector based upon their best estimates. This is the federal government's projections. They've included exactly what you just described in terms of the New South Wales governments for more renewables and the consequences that will have for existing coal, and it shows very clearly that they're expecting that under those projections, coal will close. And yet that language, as far as I'm aware, hasn't yet entered into the narrative that our politicians are talking about. And James, I guess the thing I find a little intriguing is that the more the government puts emphasis on low-cost renewables, and the announcement about supporting, having a stretch target of $15 a megawatt hour for solar. I mean, the more you do that, the more likely it is you do exactly more of this, right? I don't see how you can actually say we're going to keep coal in the system for a long time yet and do a whole lot of stuff which is actually going to do the opposite. It isn't just states now; it's actually the Commonwealth saying almost the same thing.
Yeah, that's right. The economics of solar are really, really harmful to the economics of any plant that wants to run as baseload. If you've got this zero marginal cost plant running, the solar plant's running in the middle of the day, eating away at the margins of coal-fired generators, it's really hard then to spread the costs. Well, this is one of the reasons why we have not seen any serious credible proposal to build another coal-fired power station, because investors know that they won't be able to spread the high fixed cost of that asset over a large number of units of electricity, because they won't be able to sell nearly as much during the middle of the day as was possible historically. The other, I guess, technology that's in the government's low emissions technology statement is around reducing the cost of energy storage and of effectively firming electricity. And if you can do that as well, then you're not just starting to eat into the margins of coal, but also of gas. I think, so Carrie was mentioned before that gas is kind of a key transition fuel in Australia. We would kind of describe it, I think we mean the same thing, but we would describe it more as a backstop. It's kind of what's there when everything else fails, or when there's long periods of really high demand, low solar output and low wind. The gas is what's there then to provide that power for you. We're not envisioning the huge amount of electricity that coal provides today. That's not going to be provided by gas as the coal plants close. It's going to be mostly provided by renewables that are being built. But gas then has an important role to provide reliability in the system during those times when the system is most under stress.
Yes.
Sorry, Kerry, I think that issue of the way those interactions occur is going to be critical to both maintaining that reliability, getting the new investment, and keeping costs down. Do you think and when you look at the arrangements between the states, one of the things I noticed that came out sort of around the time when your final report was presented and the ministers met was there still seems to be not yet strong agreement between the jurisdictions, federal and the state territory governments, as to how they would see some of these policy initiatives unwinding. Do you think, is that likely to be an issue, or do you think would you be a bit more confident that when they actually have to grapple with the reality, they'll find ways of coming to a more common view?
I think it is a big issue, and I think that the NEM is in great danger of turning into a number of separate jurisdictions. So each of the states just going their own way, and in that sort of world, the business between them would be a limited amount of interconnectors, and it does lead to a system that's not as efficient. So tenants, clients will face greater expense, and the sort of diversity that we can get by more interconnections both within and between the states is going to become much more difficult. And one of the things that the industry is grappling with at the moment is the enormous transmission bill that's required, and getting that done. It does need to be done pretty much over this decade and a bit into the 30s. But it takes a long time to build transmission, and nobody, frankly, wants it in their backyard. So it's that's slowing things down. So while that happens, each of the states will just make sure that their reliability is internal to them.
Well, I think that's when tenants' slightly asymmetrical risk profile becomes important, right? Because when you end up in that situation, the chances are that everything's going to be more expensive. because the states, I think it's true to say that most of the time the states see themselves as the ones who are really going to be under the gun if there's any problem with interruptions to the power supply. And so they'll do whatever's necessary. And they'll almost certainly even put a higher value on the extra marginal cost of reliability than households or even tenants members would put on it, I suspect. So, I think how
they do, Tony, because they've put their reliability targets up higher than what the NEM target is in many cases, and that just adds to cost.
Yeah, it's a. I think the way we think about reliability is one of the more difficult ones in terms of how you design markets with confidence that can properly value reliability. Given that I think it's about all of us. How much we value reliability depends upon so many other factors of what's going on at the time, and so someone's got to make a decision, and there's always going to be some people who are prepared to pay a bit more, I suppose, and they're people on life support systems or they're running hospitals or whatever. But yeah, I think the risk is we end up being on the cost side more of a problem. So Tanner, how do your members then? What do you do about that? How do you, apart from participating in the various forums, the ones including the ones that the Energy Security Board has been running, how do you then think about trying to manage what, if your concern becomes real, turns out to be quite a difficult challenge in terms of the cost of it and anything else? I mean, disconnecting from the grid is probably not the first option.
Not for most, well, not for almost anybody, I think. I mean, batteries are getting cheaper every year, but the amount of storage that an individual user, just as for the whole system, having batteries for everything would not be an efficient solution. For an individual user, you need a lot of capacity before you can fully cut the cord to the grid. And that's very pricey. So, look, industry is very diverse in how energy intensive it is, diverse in the ways that it uses energy, and size, sector, many different characteristics. So it's going to be different strokes for different folks. There's been a lot of interest in recent years in corporate power purchase agreements with renewable energy developers to control financial risks. There was a driver there around renewables goals and corporate social responsibility, but there was also a driver of let's get a more stable price for a portion of our purchases. And I think, there was as prices fell recently, there was a dip in interest in those PPAs. But the falling cost of firmed renewable supply increases the share of a company's purchasing needs that they can find somebody to contract with for, we've seen not a reversion to high prices, but certainly a little bit of a bounce back and certainly some flattening of what had been declining overall prices. So I think that the interest in those, in that particular method is going to increase. But yes, individual users can help themselves through, if they've got demand flexibility, that helps. If they've got efficiency and other forms of energy management, that helps. But we're all in this together to a great extent. If we don't have good systemic outcomes, then everybody is going to wind up paying more, and going for the best, holding out for perfection is not a good idea, but going for the best solutions that we can get is good. And I've actually got some hopes that we're actually going to be in a better state of mind on this in the very near future. All these transmission mega projects that we've been talking about, like, they are very expensive in terms of the amount of capital being deployed, but we're going to be better able to assess their value and have a bit more confidence in what they mean for end users over the next year or two, because in part we're getting more experience with actually building these projects. We haven't built a lot of transmission for a long time. But also the economic regulation process that says whether these things can be built and consumers made to pay for them or not. It has been working in a very fuzzy space where it's had to consider scenarios for the system and its development that extend from low ambition on emissions, not much happening there for a while, through to very high rates of change. And a bunch of those low ambition scenarios should by rights be falling away now, because the Commonwealth has made the I don't know it's not a trifecta. You've got a lot of, but they've completed the set of national authorities committed to net zero by 2050. And so that should flow through to a higher assessed value to these projects across the scenarios that have to be considered, a clearer value proposition to consumers out of them. And so the on-the-ground stuff around siting and people not liking great big transmission lines near them, like that's going to remain a big challenge to resolve, and it can go badly wrong. We just saw a couple of days ago in the US a ballot initiative axing a mega transmission project that was core to the state of Massachusetts power plans. The citizens of Maine didn't want it. And so it won't be happening. We don't have ballot initiatives here, but people definitely can make their displeasure felt. And so we really need to resolve that in ways that satisfy people, not just steamrolling them.
Yeah, that's true. I think Kerry referred a little bit to that sort of potential in Australia with our transmission system as well. Look, Kerry, finally, on this in this session, given you've stepped out of your more than full-time, part-time job, chairing the Energy Security Board, how do you see, as you look at it now, and given what's been going on in COP to some extent and what that means for what they're saying about the phase out of coal-fired power, do you think more positive or less so than when you took on that role 3 or 4 years ago?
I definitely feel more positive, Tony. I think there's huge change going on in the electricity sector, and it's not going to stop. And I think the only issue is the one of chaos and more efficient management, which would be very nice to see. But it does depend on a coordination of policy and an agreement to discuss it. Yeah. It would be nice if we had a carbon price, because that would help everybody make good decisions.
Indeed. I think, we'll find a different name for it. Maybe that'll have, because I'm always, when someone says something like, wouldn't it be nice? I'm reminded of the My Fair Lady song, I think. Wouldn't it be lovely? Look, James, thank you very much. Kerry, thank you. And Tennant, thank you. It's been a very useful conversation. I found an interesting conversation. Hopefully people listening in have appreciated it. And thank you. And we'll now move to the second session. Thank you.
Thanks, Tony.
Thanks, Tony.
Thank you.
Okay. So in the second session, we're going to take a slightly more, still an Australian focus, but from an international perspective. So what does all this going on in the global energy system mean for Australia? And Kerry touched upon it briefly in some of her comments. So to have this conversation, again, we've got three people with, I think, who will have quite different perspectives and bring some thinking to what this looks like. The first is Alison Reeve. Alison is the Deputy Program Director for Energy and Climate Change at the Grattan Institute. It seems like about 10 years, Alison, to you, I'm sure, but it's only been about 5 months. Came on board early this year and was deeply involved in some work we finished publishing only this week. But a deep background in energy and climate policy at a federal and state level. And most recently did some work for the Australian Renewable Energy Agency and before that led the task force on the hydrogen strategy for Australia, the one that Dr. Finkel was there, which he chaired. Secondly, we've got Chris Mcgraw. Chris Mcgraw is the Chief Executive Officer of 5B. I suspect not too many people on this call have heard of 5B, but if the aspirations that 5B have, you'll hear a lot more about them in the future. There are some big issues afloat in relation to, can we really take advantage of the comparative opportunity, comparative advantage we might have in renewable energy, and what do we need to do that? And it's going to require the sort of companies of the sort that Chris is involved with to be able to physically deliver and commercially deliver what at the moment may simply be a bit of a theory. And Stanaya Kisti, who's from Beyond Zero. Beyond Zero emissions is, I think, one of the, there's been a lot of advocates in the environmental side and climate policy who've come and gone, but Beyond Zero emissions is one of the ones that's been having an increasingly clear and loud voice over recent times in terms of what, not just, wouldn't it be good to get rid of to do something about climate change, but looking at particularly some of the opportunities that could emerge for Australia and Australians in that space. So on that note, let's get into it, and we'll get things started. So look, Alison, it seems to me that when you look so far, I'm not sure what the scorecard will look like when COP26 is finished, but it's been up and down and up and down, and there's good bits and bad bits. People will pick out the things they think are fantastic and the things they think are absolutely terrible. There's been a lot of announcements, probably more announcements and more pledges than we've seen. And we've also seen now not the IEA updating its own assessment of where we might be if everyone does what they said they were going to do. So in that world, for a country that basically has a very significant export industry in coal and liquefied natural gas, and people still seem to talk about that as though it's going to go on into the future. Alison, what does that mean? How do you square those?
I think that really, if you've been paying attention, I think the writing on the wall has been there for coal exports for quite a while now. As soon as people started making net zero pledges, that I think was the beginning of the end for coal. Just to give people a sense of, when we say that those are our big exports, coal was about $54 billion worth of exports last year. About 3/4 of the thermal coal and just over half of the metallurgical coal go to export markets that have made net zero pledges. So that kind of tells you that at some point that market is probably going to end. We sort of talked a little bit earlier about some of the commitments that came out overnight. We've now got another 23 countries saying they want to phase out coal. The one that I think is significant for Australia is Korea. That's about 15% of our thermal coal exports go to Korea. And then when you look at something like gas may have a little bit longer, but we were just saying in the previous discussion, we used to talk about gas as a transition fuel. It's a backup, if it's anything. And when you look at, say, our two major gas markets, Korea and Japan, they've both made very significant near-term commitments as well as their net zero commitments to sort of move to a much greater share of renewable energy by 2030 and to cut their other emissions by 2030 as well. And those are going to cut into our gas markets. When we think about how we square it, the export commodity that is much larger than either coal or gas, and in fact, I think larger than coal or gas put together, but don't quote me on that, is iron ore. Now, iron ore should actually be a beneficiary out of the energy transition because we have to build an enormous amount of stuff to, in order to phase out coal, you have to build a heck of a lot of wind, heck of a lot of solar, a lot of, hydro for pump storage, you have to build a lot of batteries, and all of that is going to take steel in one form or another. If we can now, there's a big caveat around that, which is, can we make that without coal? Because at the moment, that's where a lot of our metallurgical coal goes effectively along with our iron ore to turn into steel. But with the countries that are now signing up, I mean, I think the pledge that came out of COP overnight was a bunch of countries saying that they want to make near zero emission steel the preferred choice in global markets, established and growing in every region by 2030. Now, that's a huge stretch goal, but the reason that goal is there as well is because nearly 3/4 of the blast furnaces that run on coal worldwide will reach the end of their life in the 2020s. And so we're coming up to the decision point about what we replace them with. With those decisions that are made in the 2030s are actually going to be really, really important for the future of coal, because blast furnaces last for a long time. If those are coal blast furnaces, they're going to lock in coal markets for a long time. But if they're not, they're going to lock out coal for a long time. So I mean, to sort of come back to your question, how do we square this? I think we need to be looking at where are the things that are going to grow, and how do we jump onto that bandwagon? And to me, the ones that maybe don't get as much attention as things like hydrogen and electricity are iron ore and minerals. And we're actually already really well placed to do that. We are very, very good at digging stuff up in this country and finding markets for it and shipping it to those markets very efficiently. I think the IEA's forecast for the value of the critical minerals that will be needed for the energy transition, they say that that's probably going to be worth about double to Australia what our coal exports are currently worth to us now. So coal's currently worth about 54 billion. So there's $100 billion there between, over the coming decades that we should be able to take advantage of. And so that's kind of the pivot, I think, that we have to make. And I mean, I thought it was interesting. I saw something Adam Bant said in an interview where he said the best job for a coal miner is another mining job. And there will be those other mining jobs. It's just that they're not going to be in coal if we pivot properly.
Yeah, I think that's probably true. We piece of work that we did at Grattan last year talked about the fundamental economics that might very well favour green steel, and not only because it would reduce emissions from steel manufacturing, but also a lot of the trades that are involved in the carbon intensive industries, including coal mining and coal-fired power, could be transferable to manufacturing, built off the back of that, and things like green steel potentially could do that. But of course, none of that gets handed to us on a plate. It will be a very competitive market. And so I know you guys at Beyond Zero have done a lot of work thinking about the opportunities beyond zero emissions. Great name to have when you align that with what you're trying to do. How then do you guys see this these opportunities emerging as we get down the track for Australia?
Yeah, well, I think I've got to echo a lot of what Alison said. We released a report recently called Export Powerhouse, and we looked at 4 green commodity areas, green steel being one of them, green aluminium, renewable hydrogen, and sustainably mined critical minerals like lithium and nickel and rare earths. And across those 4 commodity areas, we looked at 3 different scenarios depending on how we set ourselves up to plan for them. And we realized that in the go for gold scenario, the ideal scenario, we could be making 333 billion by 2050 if we start planning for it now. And it really comes back to that point about setting ourselves up for the future and thinking about what we're going to do in terms of replacing our lost export income from fossil fuels, as Alison mentioned, and making sure that we can set ourselves up in time for that decline once our trading partners start progressing their net zero targets. So that's why we actually think manufacturing is critical to that, because we can make this stuff. We are exporting raw commodities right now, and we can use those same raw commodities to be making the green commodities that the world's going to need and that we're going to need onshore. So our work with industry has really been thinking about what has to happen now. And there are so many companies that are already doing this work. I'm really interested to hear Chris's insights. But it's not just about renewable energy exports. It's actually about what are we going to make? And the policy settings have to align and be prepared to think about how businesses can establish those value chains onshore.
So how do you see that? That Alison made the point that Australia's companies are probably world leaders in digging stuff out of the ground and putting it on a train and putting it on a ship, and whether that's coal or iron ore in particular. But then you look at what's involved in these sectors. So we're very good at doing that, and we export most of the jobs that go with when you think about the final product, often we buy back again. And that is probably true of our primary produce in agriculture as well. How then what's going to be different? Why wouldn't this just be a matter of we're just going to find ways to export the energy in a different form and all the jobs will still be in other places? What's going to be different this time?
I think what's different is the opportunity ahead of us and the need to be thinking about what we're going to do to replace those lost export incomes. And we have the three necessary ingredients to think about that from a manufacturing perspective. We've got vast mineral wealth, and we've got abundant renewable energy that we can share across thousands of kilometres. We also have the highly skilled workforce that's got a history in heavy industry and energy exports. So with those three ingredients, we can think about how we set ourselves up onshore. And it really comes back to the point of what makes us different, what have we got, and making sure that we're actually using what we've got now in those critical minerals that are here, and thinking about what the world's going to need. So for example, lithium in batteries. And there are companies that are doing this already. There are so many companies we're working with in the Hunter that are thinking about this. And I think the sad thing is a lot of those products are already being exported overseas, but we're not seeing the use case in Australia yet because we haven't set up the right policy settings for it.
I think one of the things that's important that needs to be different this time as well is how we power that mining. So mining is actually a really significant source of Australia's emissions. It's not just the coal that gets burnt overseas, it's actually the digging up here of coal and of minerals is actually quite emissions intense. And when you move further up that value chain into processing, that actually tends to become more emissions intensive using traditional processes. So this is why the renewable advantage is actually really important. And the other reason that that's really important is that about 40% of our foreign investment goes into the mining industry. And the countries that is coming from are all countries that have put in place climate and carbon risk disclosure. So those investors are going to be required to figure out what the carbon risk is on that investment. And so that is where we are actually really well positioned if we want to take advantage of it. And it also means that we can get, the new jobs and the new income and so on, but without pushing our emissions up again, because, we wouldn't want to just replace emissions from the coal industry with emissions from the mining industry.
So, Chris, it's all very well for a think tank like Grattan or a very strong advocate organisation like Beyond Zero to talk about this stuff. Someone's got to actually do it. How do you turn what seems to be incredibly interesting opportunities, recognising that we won't have the world to ourselves? How are you thinking about turning those opportunities into commercial reality when, there's a lot of stuff to be done, the costs are going to be high, who's going to pay for it, all that sort of stuff? How do you manage to maintain your enthusiasm on a day-to-day basis, and how do you think about approaching this, what appears to be, one of the biggest issues Australia's economically ever faced, but it's got to come down to practical stuff, right?
I am an eternal optimist. I think it takes one to leave a corporate job and start a business and build it from the ground up. But I also say that in the sense of having real conviction and an ability to genuinely believe and kind of see what this future opportunity looks like. I think there's always this dichotomy between challenge and opportunity. I think in almost every challenge there is an opportunity there, but in this case, this global transition we're looking at, for me, is just all about the opportunity. The opportunity is incredibly significant. And we find future back thinking and strategy work really powerful, particularly when we're thinking about such a vast transition, because humans kind of have this inherent inability to kind of think about exponential change and think about vast amounts of transformation from our current present state. The movie 2040, I think, was a great example of this, that really brought to life what that would feel like in a visceral way to be in a completely sustainable, renewable society. And we try to think about that a lot from our own technology perspective and what that means for us in our industry and how we should be how we need to be positioning for that, and also think about that from an Australian country and also global perspective in terms of like, what does that mean about the shift of things that are required and the opportunities that sit behind that, and how we best posture for that. I'm not sure if anyone listened, but we tried to coin Industrial Revolution 5.0 as being linked to the clean energy, massive amounts of clean energy, about 2 months ago. And David Attenborough actually in his COP26 opening used the phrase Industrial Revolution as well. We've been thinking a bit more deeply about that. And I think what we see we need is something that's more akin to kind of a meta form of Industrial Revolution, which is not just an industrial revolution like has happened at a series of stages before, from energy and steam machines to automation and production, and then through data and so on and so forth, but one that links up all of those, benefits from everything we've learned from those, uses the best technology we have available to us today, and does all of those things in an actual renewable, sustainable way. The previous industrial revolutions have been incredibly beneficial for the world in terms of the opportunities they create, the economic growth, the jobs, education, healthcare, mobility, gender equality, all of the UN millennial goals, based on access to energy and then electricity. But they've all contributed massively to some serious problems in the world, topically here, carbon emissions, but also environmental and also social issues around urbanisation and lots of other kind of related challenges. And I think that there's a huge opportunity for us to be learning from that and looking forward, genuinely seeing and believing and feeling what that means in terms of that transition, and charging with absolute rigour towards it. But also I think that the really interesting thing that we find is when you genuinely believe that future is possible, and then when you sit in that future and look back, you realise that things are going to break to get there in a way that you don't really realise until you genuinely believe it's possible. You have to get kind of somewhat terrified by the magnitude of the challenge to really kind of viscerally believe that, think deeply about that. I'm glad.
I hope you don't spend all your life in absolute terror, Chris.
The right amount.
So what do you a lot of the discussion, because of the nature of this COP26 thing, is about governments, right? I mean, there are a lot of companies who are represented at the COP as well, taking their own position. Some of them have announced their own pledges. Many companies in Australia have announced various forms of net zero by 2050, and various, they all mean slightly different things, frustratingly. From the perspective of what you're trying to do with 5B, do you need governments just to get out of the way, or are there particular policy positions that would really, I'm sure if they just throw a whole lot of cash at you, that wouldn't be a bad thing, but in terms of policies that would really help accelerate the sort of things you're trying to do, are there any particular things you'd put at the top of the list?
I mean, I think we, as an eternal optimist, but I think objectively, we also consider this transition in front of us is inevitable. Economics are driving it, capitalist markets are driving it. It is going to happen, but I think what we see is that the whole thing is a race, and it's a race on a global level against time, and 2050 is the ticking time bomb. And for a country, it's a race to capture and create as much of that value as possible in that journey during that transition. And I think therefore we have an option as a country to either kind of begrudgingly be kind of pulled down that journey and kind of be playing catch up time and time again, or to actually get in front of the curve and invest heavily in what a really obvious no regrets trajectory for the country and its economy. And I think that's where the government plays, like how government sets policy and market signals are really critical in that difference of not whether the world will get there or not, but as to whether Australia is actually going to capture that opportunity instead of being dragged begrudgingly through it. And I think even the government's obviously changed their tune quite significantly recently for the positive in some ways, but it still represents to me kind of present forward kind of thinking. They talk about $15 a megawatt hour as a wonderful outcome. We can do it, by the way. That's not going to be particularly difficult to achieve. But they talk about it as a stretch target. It's not a stretch target. That is an inevitability. And once you believe that it's an inevitability, then what you're willing to do and invest in and support get there faster and to accelerate it and to de-risk it, and also to posture the whole country around, well, what are you going to do once you're there? How are you going to position industries to be ready to use that? That's the really critical role that I think government can play. And if it does, it's going to be for the betterment of the country and also the world. I think the thing that I see now in our industry specifically, I mean, we've grown a clean tech hardware infrastructure company from the ground up in amongst a whole bunch of software as a service companies that are our peers. And it's bloody hard work. Our minimum viable product weighed 5 tons compared to a line of software code. And that's inherent, I think, in clean tech and in climate generally, is that it's a very physical challenge. It's huge. It's humongous. It's dictated by the laws of physics in a way that is different to the speed that data and digital technology is kind of evolving. And the cycle times that we experience in the industry, both in terms of our development cycles, our sales cycle, our project build cycles, are really long. And the same exists on the demand side as well, to get industry to pivot and position around how do you harness all of this abundant, massive scale, like ultra low cost solar, or wind or hydro, or whatever else. We have to invest now to be ready to use that $15 a megawatt hour, or probably less, by 2030 or as soon as we can achieve it, to actually be charging by that stage.
Well, I think I'm beginning to understand why you're a terrified optimist, actually, Chris. I was worried there for a while, but I think I'm starting to get it. Thank you. Alison, one of the pieces of work that you put a lot of effort into earlier this year that we published was around this part, aspects of what Chris has been talking about, the sort of industry transition and what has to happen from an industry perspective. Because, in Australia, a lot of times industry would just like government to get out of the way, or they'd like a subsidy or whatever, right? Do you think this particular opportunity that's arising, and I guess there's a challenge on the other side of it as well, means we need some different thinking about the relationship between government and industry, and what might that look like?
Yeah, I guess, I think traditionally people have said, either the government needs to lead or follow or get out of the way, right? And what we're sort of facing in the industrial sector, just for context for the listeners, industrial sector is roughly a third of Australia's emissions. A fair chunk of that is the coal and gas industry. But then there's all the rest. And when we look at all of the assets that are in that, in that all the rest chunk, and how you turn them over and turn them into zero emissions assets within the space of about 30 years, it's actually a very, very challenging transformation task, and it will probably take a very large amount of capital, and it's all going to happen at once. I think is sort of, this is kind of the scare, the terrified optimist kind of thing. It's like, it's not just that you are turning over a steel mill, it's that you're turning over a steel mill at the same time as all of the other, as the cement plants and the fertilizer plants and everything else. And I think the thing that is sort of needed, needs to change about how the government does things is, at the moment, I think governments tend to sit back a bit and say, well, you come to us when you're ready to change, and we'll talk about whether we give you a grant or a loan, or we'll regulate you and make you change. And neither of those quite work for when you're trying to make big decisions about big assets. So the we'll regulate you is useful for squeezing down the emissions on the plants that will keep operating over the time. The grant and the loan stuff might be useful, but you've got to think about how many of those you're going to have to try and do at once. And one of the things that we talked about in our industrial report is how the government could start preparing now, so that when these assets decisions start to come up, it has actually got a decent pot of cash effectively to offer to companies that come to it. Because the other thing is that because a lot of these assets are really long-lived, the decision that they have one chance between now and 2050 to become a zero emissions asset. And if they don't make a zero emissions decision, then we're locking in a whole stack of emissions for a long time. So we may need to be prepared, and those asset owners may need to be prepared to do something that looks suboptimal from an economic perspective in order to get the emissions outcome. And so that's where you potentially do need governments to work with them. And I think there needs to be a bit of a process of not just the government sitting there and saying, oh, look, we'll get the checkbook out when you're ready. It's probably more a process of co-discovering what the best future might look like for that facility, or for that facility with all of the other facilities that are around it, right? I mean, when we think about where a lot of these assets are, they're often in clusters around our known industrial areas, right? There's a lot of them in Gladstone, there's a lot of them in Hunter and so on. So it's also thinking regionally about, well, if everything in the Hunter is going to change, what's the optimal kind of thing of how we change that? And how can the companies and the communities that are involved work with governments to sort of do a bit of co-discovery to kind of design the future that they want? I think it sort of comes back to what Chris was saying, is like accept the inevitable that you're going to be in a net zero world, and then design how you want to be getting there, rather than sort of seeing this as a slightly more painful process of trying to make yourself into the net zero world. It's kind of start from where you want to be and design how you get there. And that governments are not very good at doing that. Companies can be good at it for their own company, but not necessarily thinking about how that happens around them. And the communities that host these assets actually need to be involved in those conversations as well, because they are the ones who will have transmission lines running through, you know, what was previously a nice park or something, or they're the ones who work in the plants or whatever. So there needs to be some sort of involvement for them in that process as well.
It sounds like it's for Australia, at least, and maybe some other countries as well, but quite a different relationship between industry and government from what we historically tend to see, where, as you say, it's to set the policy and away you go, or provide some grant funding or whatever. But this idea of actually being much more integrally involved. And I think, Sana, you've, Beyond Zero has done some work, particularly I think around the Hunter, looking at how might this actually be done. And it's not just sort of a theory, but, you know, if there's one part of Australia, I mean, that is going to be affected by this, it is the Hunter. I mean, to some extent, Central Queensland and the Illawarra, but the Hunter is sort of exemplifies it. So when you think about sort of putting some meat on the bones of this idea of delivering the opportunities that are there, how do you see that working in the way that gets things moving? And what do you see as the role of governments, plural? I mean, it may not just be the federal government.
Yeah, so I think it picks up on a point that is worth being very explicit about. It comes down to collaboration, and it's not just between governments and industry, it's actually within industry collaboration is necessary. And one of the main things that we've been working on over the past 18 months is thinking about what renewable powered manufacturing can look like, and really thinking about a precinct approach. So renewable energy industrial precincts is our recommendation for a national rollout of what this could look like to really capitalise on these opportunities for the regions. And the one thing that has come out so clearly from all of the industry stakeholders that we've spoken to is that they want to be involved with other industry stakeholders to think about consortium approaches and collaboration, because it makes the case for co-location, it makes the case for shared infrastructure and transmission lines. And once communities can see what the future looks like with those kinds of established precincts, there is more social license for actually building out that infrastructure. But it's really interesting to me. I was at the Impact X Summit this week, and I heard a presentation from Greta Stevens from BlueScope, and the point that she wanted to hammer home was, again, for BlueScope to really set down the path of green steel, they need to collaborate. And it's not like industry hasn't collaborated before. In the Hunter Valley, there is an amazing coal network and chain that has delivered tracks of coal and shared infrastructure that works for the whole industry. And it's about capitalising on that again in places like the Hunter and Gladstone to really make sure that these regions are set up, both from the community perspective, from a government perspective, and within industry to capitalise on these opportunities.
I think it's once you've deeply recognised in a slightly terrifying way how significant that
I guess it's not a model that Australian businesses and governments have very often adopted. I mean, other countries probably do it almost as a matter of a cultural difference, maybe. But I think, I don't know whether you guys looked at it much somehow, but I think, Newcastle is a fantastic example of, in the past, it has done this in a different context. It was faced with almost an existential threat with the BHP, and it would have been, I'm sure, a painful process for some people, but my understanding then is the involvement of the unions, the university, TAFE colleges, BHP, federal government, everybody was fundamentally critical. And without all of them collaborating, as Chris was saying, it probably wouldn't have got there, but it did. And so we know we can do this. And I think it's going to be, very exciting to see how this goes. I'm not sure I'm both optimistic and terrified at the same time. I'm going to get stuck with that particular analogy idea for a long time, Chris. So
you can harness it though.
I'll do that, and I'll try to remember to accredit it as well every time I do so. Look, we're just about out of time, so look, thank you very much. I think from both of these sessions we've had, there's no doubt that and I don't think this is just pure starry-eyed optimism. I think this is thought through optimism, that we are able to take a very positive view of what's coming out of COP26 and what it means for Australia. Whether or not that tends to be about how we, the electricity system, the energy system, almost certainly the biggest transformation this country has seen outside wartime, and the extent to which what has to happen in the time frame is going to be quite extraordinary. So hang on for the ride. It'll be fun, and there'll be lots of opportunities here for all sorts of ranges of organisations. So look, it leaves with me just to take a couple of other thank yous. Look, we've very much appreciated the opportunity to partner in this webinar today with the UK government. They, as the host of the COP26, clearly remain themselves. I'm not sure how terrified they were, but they certainly seem a little bit of grounds for optimism at the halfway point, and we'll see how that plays out. I thank my colleagues at Grattan who helped organise this webinar this afternoon. Thank you for all of the 6 panelists who've joined us this afternoon for their insights from their own different perspectives. And finally, to those of you who've been either watching or listening to this webinar, thank you as well. Hopefully you've got a bit of an insight from what this all means to Australia. Stay safe, go well, and I think we can only say this is a great time to be terrified with optimism. All right. Thank you and good afternoon.
Thank you. Bye.
Thanks, everybody.